Ah, what saintly monarchs we had, those crowned specimens of perfection, trembling more for their reputation than for their own children, especially if the child happened to be, God forbid, unfit for display, with a speech defect, a weak body, or an extra chromosome. Oh, the horror! What a tragedy for the throne, never mind for the family. Picture this. A tiny human, born of kings and queens, crying, breathing, living, and instantly becoming for the entire royal brood a curse, a shameful stamp better hidden away in some remote monastery, a madhouse, or, let's be brutally honest, dispatched into eternal rest in infancy, so that no one, heaven forbid, would discover that their perfect dynasty had a crack in its marble facade. Because, of course, we all understand. It wasn't armies, taxes, or starving riots that threatened crowns. It was that one little baby with Down syndrome whose almond-shaped eyes could demolish an empire's prestige faster than a lost war. The irony is that these families, whom we're taught to idolize for their humanity and service to the people, treated their own children like filthy little secrets, declared them dead while alive, erased them from genealogies, pretended they had never existed. Just imagine it, a prince born but officially dead, while he lived out his days in a dingy psychiatric ward, without visits, without affection, a shadow too shameful even to mention. And the most revolting part? Society applauded them. No one dared ask where the children had gone, why the archives had gaps, why cradles disappeared from palaces. Everyone played along with the fairy tale of spotless blood, and the royal spin doctors beamed with satisfaction. The picture was preserved, the shame concealed, the people kept believing in the myth of a perfect family ordained by God. In truth, monarchies survived not on divine favor, but on petty lies, hypocrisy, and the systematic killing or isolation of their own heirs who dared to be born imperfect. And here we might sarcastically clap our hands. Bravo, your majesties! You proved that the portrait on the palace wall matters more than a child's life, that the crown shines brightest when not dimmed by genuine love or compassion. Except, of course, this fairy tale has a sequel. Today, the same dynasties market themselves as families for the people, posing with disabled children at charity events, donating to support foundations, all under the camera flashes, as if they could wipe away centuries of cold cruelty with one banal selfie. But history doesn't forget, and we know well what lies behind those glossy smiles, a centuries-old tradition of hiding, erasing, covering up, silencing. And if you think about it, progress hasn't gone as far as we'd like to believe. Kings of the past buried children in archives. Today's kings bury them in press releases. And let's not pretend this royal hypocrisy was some minor footnote in history. It was the cornerstone of their public image, the foundation stone on which entire thrones rested, a lie polished until it gleamed like gold. They weren't guardians of tradition. They were stage managers of a grotesque theater, shoving inconvenient children out of sight like dust under a rug before foreign dignitaries arrived for supper. And the worst irony? These hidden children never threatened the monarchy. Not one baby with Down syndrome ever organized a coup or sparked a revolution. The only danger they posed was to the fragile ego of kings and queens obsessed with appearing flawless. So rather than admitting that humanity comes in many forms, monarchs chose to mutilate truth itself, turning palaces into crime scenes of silence, corridors echoing with erased names, marble halls built on shame. The people adored their perfect rulers, never realizing perfection had been manufactured by cruelty, that God's chosen families were simply better at hiding their skeletons. Down syndrome, a condition both deceptively simple in its genetic origin and yet profoundly complex in its human impact, arises from something as small and invisible to the naked eye as the presence of one extra chromosome, specifically chromosome number 21, turning the standard 46 into 47, and in doing so, altering the entire trajectory of a life, a family, and often the cultural perceptions of difference and normality. This surplus piece of genetic code is not just a numerical curiosity, but an instruction manual that slightly reshapes the body and mind, leading to recognizable physical features such as almond-shaped eyes, a flatter nasal bridge, smaller ears, and unique hand creases, as well as differences in muscle tone, motor skills, and cognitive development. But to reduce the condition to a mere list of symptoms is to miss its essence, for every individual with Down syndrome is as unique, varied, and unpredictable as any human being, shaped not only by this chromosomal variation, but also by upbringing, environment, medical care, education, and, most crucially, the love or lack of it that surrounds them. And while geneticists can explain the mechanics, how non-disjunction during cell division leads to trisomy 21, how maternal age can increase the statistical likelihood of this happening, how in some cases the extra chromosome attaches in a mosaic pattern or translocates to another chromosome. The reality of Down syndrome cannot be confined to a lab report because it reverberates across centuries of human history, from eras when such children were dismissed as monstrous births or cursed anomalies, hidden in asylums or convents, to today when they attend schools, hold jobs, act in movies, compete in athletics, and speak at international conferences, challenging not only medical assumptions, but also cultural biases about what it means to be valuable, to be capable, to be human. Indeed, the existence of an extra chromosome demonstrates in the most literal biological sense that perfection is a myth, that life is robust enough to sustain variations that once would have been unthinkable, and that humanity's cruelty or compassion toward these variations reflects more about our societies than about the chromosomes themselves. For the chromosome does not determine dignity, it merely influences development, whereas it is people, parents, teachers, neighbors, governments, who decide whether that development will be nurtured or neglected. Even within the scientific community, Down syndrome has been a source of both misunderstanding and breakthrough, with earlier centuries misattributing it to parental sin, racial mixing, or degeneration, until John Langdon Down in the 19th century described the condition in more clinical terms, and eventually modern genetics revealed the precise chromosomal cause, turning what was once shrouded in superstition into a tangible biological phenomenon, though the stigma stubbornly lingers in many parts of the world. But alongside stigma, there has been progress. Medical advances have extended life expectancy from just a few years in the early 20th century to 6 decades or more today. Early intervention programs support learning and independence, and advocacy movements led not by doctors, but by families and self-advocates have reframed Down syndrome as a part of human diversity rather than a tragic flaw. Still, the existence of that single extra chromosome continues to trigger debates about prenatal testing, selective abortion, healthcare costs, inclusion in mainstream education, and the boundaries of what society deems acceptable difference. Debates that reveal not the burden of trisomy 21, but rather the persistent discomfort many people feel toward those who challenge their narrow definitions of normal. And therein lies the irony. The extra chromosome does not doom anyone to misery, it is the prejudices of others that do. For scientific knowledge has shown again and again that people with Down syndrome can learn, work, love, and thrive when given opportunity. For centuries, long before the language of genetics, chromosomes, and medical science gave humanity a clearer picture of what Down syndrome truly is, societies across the world filtered their understanding of difference through the lenses of superstition, fear, and rigid notions of purity, so that the birth of a child with the telltale features of trisomy 21 was almost never interpreted as a natural variation in human biology, but instead cast as a supernatural warning, a divine curse, a punishment for parental sin, or a sign of corruption within the bloodline. This interpretation, born from ignorance and maintained by a desperate need for control in unpredictable times, meant that such children were denied not only medical attention or nurturing care, but also dignity, often hidden away, abandoned to institutions, or in many cases, quietly left to die, their lives sacrificed to preserve the illusion of strength and perfection in families, especially noble or royal ones, where lineage was seen as sacred and unblemished bloodlines as the currency of legitimacy. In rural villages, midwives might whisper that the child's appearance was evidence of the mother's moral failing or the father's sins, gossiping that perhaps adultery, incest, or even dealings with the devil had invited divine retribution, while priests might thunder from pulpits that the strange features were proof that God had cursed the household, and neighbors, gripped by fear of contamination, sometimes shunned entire families, seeing in one child's extra chromosome a mark that would bring misfortune on the entire community. In aristocratic circles, where family portraits and dynastic records were instruments of propaganda, the presence of such a child was considered catastrophic, a visible crack in the myth of divine right, so documents were falsified, death certificates fabricated, and whispers suppressed, while the child was hidden in monasteries, distant estates, or locked away in institutions where their existence could be denied, their presence erased from public memory. This cultural climate, fueled by fear of the unknown, meant that Down syndrome was rarely understood as a condition of the individual, but instead interpreted symbolically, as a stain on the family, a reminder of human imperfection, or even as a living omen of decline and collapse, and this burden of meaning, placed unfairly on the smallest and most vulnerable, did immense harm not only to the children, but to the societies that treated them as objects of shame rather than as people. The irony, of course, is that in cultures where superstition dominated, the same societies often celebrated physical difference in other contexts, marking unusual birthmarks as signs of divine favor, revering children born under rare celestial events as blessed. Yet when it came to Down syndrome, the pattern of almond-shaped eyes, the low muscle tone, and the developmental differences were consistently framed in the harshest, most damning light, as though nature had made a mistake, and that mistake had to be hidden, punished, or corrected through erasure. Even as medicine advanced, the shadow of these ancient beliefs lingered, so that well into the 20th century, parents were told to institutionalize their newborns immediately, to grieve in silence, to carry on as though nothing had happened, and for families tied to royalty or political power, the stakes were even higher, because an imperfect child threatened not just gossip but the legitimacy of dynasties, the illusion that God himself had chosen their blood to rule, which made Down syndrome, tragically, not a medical matter but a political one. The words used, curse, weak blood, God's punishment, were not mere descriptions, but weapons, designed to wound parents, to enforce silence, to police the boundaries of normality, and above all to maintain hierarchies of worth. For by declaring such children cursed, societies implicitly reassured themselves that their own lives were blessed, that their own offspring were pure. The story of the Bowes-Lyon sisters, Nerissa and Catherine, cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, is one of the most chilling examples of how the obsession with image, prestige, and dynastic perfection within the British royal family could outweigh even the most basic duties of love and honesty. For these two women were born into privilege, connected to one of the most powerful families in the world, yet their lives unfolded in an institution, not a palace. Their names officially declared among the dead, while they continued to breathe, age, and suffer in obscurity. Nerissa, born in 1919, and Catherine in 1926, displayed from an early age clear signs of intellectual disability. And though modern science might now recognize that one or both likely had Down syndrome or a closely related condition, their family, terrified of scandal and of contaminating the royal myth of genetic strength, decided not to raise them within the household, but instead placed them in the Royal Earlswood Hospital, a long-term psychiatric institution in Surrey, where, stripped of their titles and their status, they became patients rather than princesses, their royal blood meaningless once it threatened the pristine facade of the monarchy. From that moment forward, they were not only physically removed from the family, but symbolically erased. Official records listed both as deceased, and for decades the truth remained buried, as if two branches of the family tree had been hacked away, their existence inconvenient to the narrative of a perfect dynasty chosen by God to reign. This erasure was not a simple clerical error. It was an intentional decision to rewrite reality, to choose a fiction of death over the uncomfortable truth of disability. And in doing so, the family not only condemned the sisters to lives of institutional isolation, but also sent a clear message about what kind of imperfections could and could not be tolerated at the heart of Britain's ruling class. The sisters themselves, by all accounts, received few, if any, visits from relatives. They lived and died, largely forgotten, surrounded by other institutionalized individuals rather than embraced by kin. And when Nerissa died in 1986, her grave was reportedly marked with nothing more than a plastic marker until the media exposed the story and public outrage forced a correction. Catherine lived until 2014, which means that for nearly 9 decades she existed as a ghost in the royal family's narrative, a living person whom the official histories had killed off. The scandal erupted in the 1980s when journalists uncovered their true situation, and the public, horrified, began to ask what kind of family could so ruthlessly deny its own blood, especially while presenting itself to the nation as a model of duty, morality, and compassion. The contrast was too stark to ignore. On the one hand, a monarchy staging weddings, christenings, and jubilees as demonstrations of continuity and strength. On the other, 2 women in institutional beds cut off from those very celebrations, whose only crime was to have been born with disabilities that threatened to puncture the myth of perfection. And here lies the brutal irony. In a family where countless members lived lives of scandal, infidelity, political blunders, and public embarrassments, it was not the philanderers or the failed leaders who were erased, but 2 women whose only fault was genetic difference, 2 individuals whose lives might have testified to resilience, compassion, and the true breadth of human dignity if they had been embraced instead of hidden. Their fate demonstrates that even in the supposedly enlightened 20th century, long after science had begun to demystify conditions like Down syndrome, the fear of scandal still outweighed compassion, and image remained more sacred than truth. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, a figure both present and absent in the annals of royal history, represents one of the strangest paradoxes of monarchy. She was at once visible enough to be sold as an image, printed on postcards like a token of dynastic pride, yet she was simultaneously invisible in the real mechanics of power, court ritual, and public life, excluded from the very sphere that gave her family its significance, and this dual existence, commodified as a symbol while silenced as a person, exposes the peculiar cruelty of royal representation. Born in 1842 as the daughter of Prince Albert of Prussia and Princess Marianne of the Netherlands, Alexandrine came into the world at a time when European royalty was obsessed with projecting an image of strength, stability, and superiority. Yet she suffered from a developmental disability, what historians now often suspect was Down syndrome, and this single fact was enough to dictate the trajectory of her life, no matter her noble lineage. Unlike some of her counterparts, such as Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, who were erased from records and confined in institutions, Alexandrine was not entirely hidden. Her family allowed her likeness to circulate in the form of postcards and photographs, which meant the public could recognize her face, her name, and her place within the dynasty. But this limited acknowledgement did not translate into real acceptance. She did not appear at state occasions, she was not trained to participate in ceremonial duties, and she was quietly excluded from the machinery of court life, effectively sidelined into a half-existence, known but not acknowledged, seen but not heard, documented but not celebrated. The irony is cutting. At a time when postcards were exploding as a new medium of popular culture, when royals were being marketed as celebrities before celebrity culture had even fully formed, Alexandrine's image could be bought and traded by ordinary people, giving the illusion that she was a fully integrated member of the royal family's story. Yet behind palace walls, she was kept at a distance from the pageantry, as though her disability rendered her unfit for the stage upon which monarchies performed their own myths. This contradiction underscores the monarchy's desperate balancing act between visibility and concealment. They could not completely erase Alexandrine without drawing suspicion, yet they could not allow her genuine presence to puncture the illusion of aristocratic superiority, so they settled on a compromise, to let her exist in the shadows of representation without granting her the dignity of participation. In this sense, Alexandrine's postcards are not mere curiosities of royal memorabilia. They are artifacts of hypocrisy, relics of a dynasty that wanted to benefit from the appearance of inclusion while practicing exclusion in reality. For Alexandrine herself, this must have meant a lifetime of quiet separation, watching as siblings and cousins were groomed for roles in the great theater of monarchy, while she remained on the margins, forever part of the family tree, yet never truly part of its story. Her fate reveals not only the personal tragedy of exclusion, but also the broader cultural stigma around disability in the 19th century, a period that prided itself on scientific progress, yet treated difference as a flaw to be minimized, hidden, or controlled. Alexandrine's life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the function of monarchy itself. If the royal family is supposed to embody the nation, why must its members conform to narrow standards of perfection? If sovereignty is grounded in the symbolism of family, what does it mean when certain family members are denied their symbolic role? The postcards bearing her face become emblems of this contradiction, souvenirs of a princess who was there and yet not really there, trapped in the limbo of selective acknowledgement. The story of Anne de Gaulle, daughter of the infamously stiff, granite-faced Charles de Gaulle, is one of those rare episodes in history where humanity and political power briefly intersect, though in a way that exposes more hypocrisy about how society has dealt with disability than it comforts with tales of familial love. Because while the general, the towering symbol of French pride, resistance, and rigid Catholic conservatism, permitted his daughter with Down syndrome to remain within the family home instead of shoving her off into a remote asylum, as was the fashion of elites and bourgeois families in the 20th century, this decision was considered so eccentric, so against the grain, that people whispered about it as though he had decided to raise a wolf in his parlor or feed a pig from the table, because that was the cruelty of the time. Disability was not to be seen, not to be acknowledged, and certainly not to be embraced. Yet Anne lived her brief 20 years not in the shadows of an institution, but in the de Gaulle household, where, for once, a man famed for his coldness softened, showing a side of himself that clashed with his public image, a father who played with her, who carried her, who smiled at her when the rest of the world was looking for another victory speech or another stoic photograph. And when she died in 1948 of pneumonia, it was Yvonne, the endlessly overshadowed Madame de Gaulle, who turned grief into something structural, founding the Foundation Anne de Gaulle, a hospital and home dedicated to children with intellectual disabilities, ensuring that her daughter's name, and by extension her condition, would not vanish into the void of unspoken shame, but become a permanent marker in French society, a contradiction to the silence and stigma of the era. But let's not pretend this was pure altruism without context. The de Gaulles could afford such gestures. Their prestige and resources gave them the privilege to break the rules without suffering the same kind of scrutiny that ordinary families did. And in many ways, this rare act of raising Anne at home was possible precisely because no one could scold or diminish the towering general, a man who had entire governments kneeling before him. But the ripple effect of this private family decision reached far beyond their estate. Suddenly, stories of Anne circulated, painting Charles de Gaulle as a paradoxical mix of stern savior of France and tender father to a child dismissed by society as less than human. And for all the propaganda value that had, it also cracked open the door for conversations that dared to suggest children like Anne were not curses, not divine punishments, not weak blood dragging down dynasties, but human beings worthy of being loved, educated, and allowed to exist visibly in families. And yet, when we lionize this narrative, we must confront the bitter reality that Anne's case was the exception, not the rule. Because across France and Europe in that period, thousands upon thousands of children with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, or simply undefined deficiencies were locked away, their names erased, their lives folded into silence while families carried on with polite dinners and political speeches. But the de Gaulle name, with its cemented place in history, made Anne's life a symbol rather than a footnote, transforming what could have been yet another hidden tragedy into a kind of holy relic for disability rights. And, if we are cynical, also a convenient halo for Charles and Yvonne's public image. For there is no denying that a hospital bearing her name enshrined the family not just as leaders of a nation, but as supposed leaders of moral conscience. So the story of Anne de Gaulle is not just about a little girl with almond-shaped eyes and a gentle demeanor who died young. It is about the collision of stigma and power, of love and politics, of grief and legacy. And it forces us to ask whether we should celebrate the rare light in the darkness or rage against the vast. In the Middle Ages, when superstition was more powerful than science, and the church dictated the rhythms of life more than medicine ever could, children born with visible differences, intellectual disabilities, or what we would now call developmental conditions, were often treated not as human beings but as burdens or omens, their very existence interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, demonic interference, or family shame, and the choices available to families, especially those of wealth or standing who feared gossip and scandal more than they feared God's judgment, were both cruel and limited. Some chose to send such children to monasteries, where cloistered silence and endless prayers could conveniently hide what polite society considered monstrous. Others preferred to lock them away in distant estates, shadowy corners of castles or rural manors where their cries would not mingle with the laughter of courtly banquets, and still others, shrouded in secrecy and hypocrisy, ended their lives altogether, with suffocating cloths, poisoned chalices, or simple neglect disguised as fate, all so that their names would never taint family trees, carefully recorded in heraldic registers. And what makes this grotesque history even more chilling is that these acts were not done by anonymous peasants, but by nobles and elites who wrote laws, funded cathedrals, and commissioned illuminated manuscripts that sang of virtue and piety, while their unwanted children with unusual faces or minds disappeared behind thick stone walls or under freshly turned earth. And monasteries, far from always being sanctuaries, often became halfway houses of abandonment, where monks burdened with their own vows of poverty were expected to care for children whose families never intended to see them again, leaving them with inadequate food, crude discipline, and little tenderness. And although a handful of these institutions undoubtedly provided more care and stability than aristocratic households would have allowed, the truth is that the transfer of a child with imperfections into religious custody was less an act of charity than a contractual burial of shame, where prayers replaced love and ritual replaced play. And if death came early, through disease, neglect, or sheer lack of human warmth, the family might even see it as divine resolution, a merciful erasure of their embarrassment. Meanwhile, those isolated in country estates lived lives of half-existence, allowed to breathe and sometimes even fed with a certain mechanical regularity, but denied contact with siblings, denied education, denied laughter in courtyards, so that their entire lifespan unfolded like a ghost story inside locked chambers, with only a handful of servants as witnesses and historians. When they stumble upon fragments of this reality in forgotten letters or marginal notes, glimpse the outlines of a system that treated disabled children not as lives to be lived, but as problems to be hidden. And the darkest irony is that medieval society, which wrapped itself in theology and proclaimed every soul as precious to God, managed to rationalize the disposal of its most vulnerable by painting them as products of sin, curses from the devil, or portents of apocalypse, and thus what should have been compassion turned into cruelty justified by doctrine, cruelty sanctified by the fear of gossip, cruelty institutionalized across centuries, until families could speak of such children only in whispers, if at all. And in the great halls where knights pledged loyalty and troubadours sang ballads of noble hearts, one could scarcely imagine that just a few doors away, in a draughty tower or barred chamber, a child of the same bloodline sat alone, rocking back and forth, unseen, unacknowledged, and unloved, a silent reminder that medieval grandeur was built not only on wars and feasts, but also on the erasure of those who did not fit the script of strength, beauty, and continuity. And when we romanticize the Middle Ages with their castles and tapestries, we rarely pause to remember the hidden children. The history of monarchy, with all its glittering crowns, gilded palaces, and carefully staged portraits, hides beneath its polished veneer an almost pathological obsession with purity, perfection, and legacy. An obsession so consuming that the humanity of children born within these dynasties, often counted for little when weighed against the possibility of a tarnished lineage. Monarchies feared what they considered imperfect blood far more than the suffering, isolation, or even the erasure of their own offspring. Dynastic continuity and the illusion of strength mattered more than compassion or truth, and this ruthless calculation led to generations of children being written out of existence, not only in terms of inheritance, but in the very annals of history. What is most chilling is not merely that these sons and daughters were hidden, confined to distant estates, cloisters, or private wards, but that their memory was actively scrubbed away by court chroniclers, royal advisors, and later by national historians eager to preserve the myth of a flawless dynasty. The child with a disability, the heir with an illness, the daughter who did not conform to expectations. These individuals became dangerous symbols of vulnerability in regimes where legitimacy rested upon divine perfection, and the bloodline was viewed as a sacred, almost mystical thread stretching back through centuries of conquest and divine right. To admit imperfection was to admit weakness, and weakness, for monarchies that ruled by fragile consensus and public awe, could not be tolerated. It is not difficult to imagine the contradictions that flourished in this system. While kings and queens commissioned portraits depicting themselves as pious, benevolent, and ordained by God, they simultaneously signed orders that confined their children to lifelong invisibility. While monarchies celebrated succession in grand pageantry, ringing bells, and lavish coronations, they quietly erased the names of heirs who never fit the mold. And yet, the silence around these hidden lives speaks volumes. Every redacted baptismal record, every official document declaring a still living child deceased, every portrait retouched to erase a figure, reveals how far these families would go to maintain the illusion of divine perfection. This fear of imperfect blood was not rooted in genuine medical ignorance alone, although superstition certainly played its role. It was an ideological choice, a conscious decision to place image over truth and power over love. It reflected an understanding of monarchy as performance. Kings and queens were not simply rulers, but living symbols, embodiments of a nation, and as such, any crack in their appearance threatened the entire edifice. But what this meant for the children themselves is far more tragic. They were not only denied a role in the pageantry of court life, but often stripped of their very personhood. Their names were omitted from genealogies, their existence concealed from courtiers, and their voices silenced behind the thick walls of institutions, convents, or forgotten rural estates. And for what? To preserve the myth that bloodlines could remain untarnished, that thrones were sustained by unbroken chains of vigor and health, when in truth, these same bloodlines were often riddled with genetic frailty caused by centuries of intermarriage. The irony could not be more cruel. Monarchies, in their desperate attempt to hide imperfection, perpetuated it through their own narrow, suffocating marriage alliances, even as they punished the children who bore the consequences of this inbreeding. To erase a child for not being perfect was to erase a part of themselves, and yet they did it again and again, as if the throne demanded sacrifices of silence. When we look at royal history today, we see the glittering official record, the coronations, the battles, the alliances, but we must never forget the invisible absences, the censored children whose lives were deemed inconvenient to the narrative. In the modern world, the narrative surrounding people with Down syndrome has undergone a seismic transformation, shifting from centuries of marginalization and erasure to one of visibility, participation, and achievement, as countless individuals now break barriers and prove that their lives are not defined by the extra chromosome that so many once used to stigmatize them. Today, they attend mainstream schools where inclusive education programs, often supported by dedicated teachers and adaptive methods, allow them to learn side by side with peers, not hidden away in special classrooms as if difference were something to be ashamed of, but instead acknowledged as part of the diverse fabric of humanity. And this exposure not only benefits students with Down syndrome, but also reshapes the perspectives of classmates who grow up understanding inclusivity as natural rather than exceptional. And as these individuals mature, Many go on to find meaningful employment, sometimes in structured programs created to ensure opportunities, but increasingly in open competitive workplaces where their skills, loyalty, and determination earn respect and dismantle stereotypes, from working in offices and retail to contributing in fields like art, athletics, and advocacy, thereby demonstrating that their contributions are real, measurable, and vital to the social and economic spheres. Moreover, the outdated notion that people with Down syndrome should be infantilized or stripped of adult agency has been thoroughly challenged by the reality of individuals forming romantic relationships, marrying, and raising families of their own. And while challenges certainly exist, discrimination in hiring, gaps in accessibility, lingering social prejudices, these obstacles are increasingly being met head-on by a global network of organizations, parents, activists, and people with Down syndrome themselves who are more vocal than ever in asserting their rights and demanding recognition not as charity cases or objects of pity, but as full human beings whose potential is limited only when society denies them opportunities. Indeed, the rise of self-advocacy movements led by individuals with Down syndrome who speak at conferences, lobby politicians, and produce media content marks a profound cultural evolution from invisibility to empowerment, and their presence in public life is mirrored by growing representation. In film, television, and the arts, where actors, models, and creators with Down syndrome challenge beauty standards and storytelling norms, reminding the broader public that authentic inclusion cannot be tokenistic, but must center the voices and lived experiences of those historically excluded. And this broad social integration is reinforced by medical advances, early intervention programs, and improved therapies that support cognitive, motor, and social development, meaning that the average life expectancy for people with Down syndrome has risen dramatically, now surpassing 60 years in many countries compared to a mere handful of decades in the mid-20th century, allowing for the possibility of lifelong growth, education, and contribution. Yet what makes this transformation especially profound is not just the institutional frameworks or policies, but the everyday stories of individuals thriving. The athlete who wins medals at the Special Olympics and inspires entire communities, the student who graduates from university after years of determination, the employee who earns admiration not out of pity, but out of professional respect, the couple who celebrates anniversaries and raises children with love and stability, the artist whose works hang in galleries, or the speaker whose words change minds, each a living testament that Down syndrome is not a destiny of tragedy, but one of possibility, provided society commits to inclusivity. And in this way, today's world stands in stark contrast to the past, for where monarchies once erased children from lineage charts and families hid relatives in asylums, now there are parades, awareness campaigns. In reflecting upon the reality that the changes we now take for granted in the perception and treatment of individuals with disabilities, including those born into royal or aristocratic families, are extremely recent, it becomes strikingly clear that just a few generations ago the situation was vastly different, and the secrecy that surrounded royal children with disabilities was not merely a matter of personal family shame, but a deeply ingrained societal attitude rooted in stigma, superstition, and the political necessity of projecting perfection and strength in ruling dynasties. This reality meant that children who were born with visible differences, intellectual disabilities, or genetic conditions were often hidden away, erased from official records, or declared deceased even while still alive, because the very idea of a monarch or noble family admitting to imperfection in their bloodline was perceived as a dangerous vulnerability that could undermine legitimacy, weaken claims to power, or fuel the narratives of rival factions. Indeed, for much of recorded history, power rested upon the illusion of divine right, of purity of lineage, of strength that seemed unassailable, and so the presence of a child with a disability was interpreted less as a unique human life with intrinsic worth and more as a symbolic blemish upon the family's honor, as a whisper of taint in the blood, as an omen that could destabilize carefully constructed myths of superiority. In the case of royal families, who were endlessly scrutinized, their portraits reproduced, their lives recorded in chronicles, The pressure to erase imperfection was immense, and while ordinary families might have hidden a child for reasons of shame or fear of poverty, royal households did so with the explicit political intent of preserving power, which is why it is only in the last century or so that archival revelations have brought to light the hidden lives of these children who, though absent from official narratives, nevertheless lived behind closed doors, often cared for by nurses, cloistered in distant estates, or placed in institutions where their stories remained unknown. And the recentness of this change cannot be overstated, because when one considers that Queen Elizabeth II's cousins were institutionalized and declared dead in official records even as they lived out their lives within hospitals, or that figures like Princess Alexandrine of Prussia were depicted in photographs yet excluded from courtly life, or that Anne de Gaulle was considered extraordinary precisely because her parents chose to raise her openly in their home, we begin to realize that we are speaking not of ancient medieval practices, but of the lived reality of people's grandparents' generation, meaning that the distance between secrecy and acceptance is not measured in centuries, but in mere decades. Furthermore, this historical proximity should remind us that progress is fragile and not inevitable, for it has taken deliberate effort by advocates, families, and changing social values to shift the perception of disability from curse, shame, or scandal into a recognition of human dignity, potential, and belonging. And even today, traces of the old attitudes persist in subtle ways when families, institutions, or media continue to treat difference as something to pity, to marginalize, or to sensationalize. Yet, what is truly revolutionary is the recognition that those who were once erased have in more recent times been brought back into history, their stories reclaimed, their humanity acknowledged. And this reclamation is part of a broader cultural movement that insists that societies, including the most powerful families at their apex, must be judged not by how well they hide vulnerability, but by how openly they embrace and include it. Thus,